Hello, it's the 24th of May. A bit of information on the Ukrainian conflict. I'll start with Bakhmut, or Chormotsk, as the Russians call the city. It's gone quiet in the last day or so, as the Russians have seemingly completed their conquest of the city. The Ukrainian attacks that were occurring on the flanks of Bakhmut appear to have been rolled back, and activity there has quietened down. Even Western media is now starting to accept the losses and starting to see some things in the West admitting that Bakhmut has now been lost. The New York Times reporting came out which showed some drone footage which has really clearly shown the devastation of Bakhmut. And one would hope that some level of stability may now return and some sort of rebuilding may begin. Although I can only imagine how difficult that must be for the residents and people who have previously lived in Bakhmut. The video footage of the city is just of pure devastation. Every building has been fire damaged or destroyed or turned into rubble. It has, though, been a successful campaign for Evgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner private military company. He has come out and claimed that Wagner is the best army in the world, that they fought in Africa and the Middle East, in Europe, and that they know how the French, the Americans, and the Africans fight. And he certainly is garnering himself quite a strong media profile, both in the West and in Russia. A number of people are thinking that he may have political aspirations post-Ukraine. He's certainly amassed quite a bit of power as the head or the leader of the Wagner PMC. He's strongly supported in Russia, as he's said to have led the victory in Bakhmut, and is fiercely supported by his soldiers. He has had some quite high-profile disputes with Russian military leadership. And it's interesting to see what will happen with Wagner and Prigozhin after their month off, where they are leaving the Bakhmut area and apparently taking approximately 4 weeks off for some R&R to rebuild their forces and their strength. And so it will be interesting to see where they may be tasked next. I've also heard reports that there is some fighting starting with another PMC, which is perhaps owned or led by Shoigu. So the PMCs in this conflict are becoming very important. And perhaps becoming far higher profile than the normal Russian armed forces. If we look at moving on to the recent incursion from Ukraine into Belgorod. Belgorod, which is a town inside the Russian border. This is not being seen as part of the Ukraine offensive that has been talked about for some months now. It appears to be more of a distraction to give Ukraine something to talk about and some PR wins to take some of the sting out of their Bakhmut loss. Perhaps a means of creating some leverage against Russia for negotiating purposes if the Ukrainians were able to capture and hold a Russian town. Although this is quite a dangerous tactic, because what has seemed to have been a short-lived, very tactical incursion into Russia, which has led by all accounts to the death of a number of soldiers and quite a large percentage of the forces involved. This is a very dangerous tactic, trading lives for short-lived PR or media coverage. There are plenty of images coming out of burnt-out American vehicles, armoured personnel carriers and light vehicles. Some reports saying 9 or more armoured vehicles in one area, 70 to 100 soldiers lost in the 24 hours of this operation. In the first area, there was apparently a battalion of perhaps up to 500 soldiers. So that gives a figure of 15 to 20% of those forces lost in a 24-hour period. The Ukrainians did capture a small bridgehead within the Russian border, but the Russian counteroffensive has now pushed the Ukrainians back into Ukraine. A second bridgehead was established a few kilometres to the east, and Russia estimates that approximately 2,000 Ukrainian resources were involved. But again, they've been pushed back into Ukraine. There are reports of drone attacks on Belgorod, which appear to be drones dropping some sort of munitions onto the town. And this incursion has been claimed by the Ukrainian intelligence and special forces director of intelligence, who's the head of those intelligence forces, which is General Kirill Bogdanov. He's indicated there shall be more of these attacks from Ukraine on the Russian border, with an aim to undermine Russian resolve and cause fear within the Russian population and online blogger community, and ideally increase political pressure against Putin. Again, how the effectiveness of this tactic seems limited, as coverage of the attack does not seem strong in the West. The Bakhmut loss seems to be gaining more headlines than the Ukrainians may have hoped. And this approach may backfire. It may cause the Russian resolve to grow, and perhaps, as Mikhail Valterson has stated today, even lead to Russia announcing a second mobilization so as to strengthen reserves along the border, or perhaps expedite the formation of territorial or border forces. In TASS, the Russian news source today, there's an article with a headline of Putin claiming that support for the war inside Russia is strengthening and growing. So, as Alexander Mercouris from the Duran summarised this morning, instead of it being represented to Russians as a war of aggression by Russia and Russian separatists, sounds like it's becoming a case of defending Russia from aggression. And that seems to be the only real consequence of this attack. So it doesn't seem to have perhaps worked in the manner that the Ukrainians may have hoped it would have. Over on the topic of the F-16s, yes, the US has announced that F-16s will be supplied to Ukraine. It looks like Netherlands may be the first to supply. Some questions around how effective they will be, where they will be stationed is a big question mark. The F-16s are a very complex technical piece of equipment, fragile in many ways, require long maintenance and logistics tails to maintain them. There's some talk of them requiring certain quality of runway, given the low engine design of them. So Ukrainian runways may not be appropriate for launching them, or Ukrainian runways may be easily damaged so as to make them unable to get off the ground. And this leads to some people suggesting that they may be stationed in Poland and may fly out of Poland, as Poland has some of the necessary infrastructure to maintain these F-16s. However, if the F-16s are to be housed and launched out of Poland, then that would seem to make Poland then become a legitimate target for Russian missile strikes, so as to retaliate against the F-16s if they are to be launched from there. So a little bit of background too, just around the British Storm Shadow long-range missiles. There are claims from the 15th and some beyond then that the Russian air defense systems have been able to shoot down the Storm Shadow missiles as well. Both Ukraine and United States saying they don't encourage strikes in Russia after the border attack, yet while the border attack is said to have been led by the Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russia Volunteer Corps. Both of these groups have very strong ties to Ukraine. The Russian Volunteer Corps, while the leaders aren't known, Denis Kapustin is a Ukrainian-based Russian nationalist, is thought to have been involved in the founding of the Russian Volunteer Corps in 2022, and the Freedom of Russia Legion, Ilya Ponomarev, who's been outspoken criticism of the Putin regime, is believed to have been one of the founders of this organisation as well. So again, it will be interesting to see what continues in the next few days if we see more and more of these small probing attacks into Russia, and some have suggested that they are probing weaknesses in the Russian defensive line along the border, which I believe 100% is the case. They are probing and looking for weaknesses. I also do feel that the one that's just occurred, though, in Belgorod has been to also provide some media distraction from the fall of Bakhmut. But the next few days and week will be interesting to see if these do continue and to see if any of these do lead into a larger offensive, as has been planned for some time by the Ukrainians.